Living in the Middle Ages meant accepting that sleeping through the entire night in one go was, basically, an unknown concept. While we complain because the neighbor plays music at 2 in the morning or because the pillow isn't ergonomic enough, medieval people had concerns that were considerably more primitive. We're talking about an era when waking up in the middle of the night wasn't an annoyance, but part of the plan. An era where sharing your bed with your siblings, your parents, and occasionally a goat was as normal as checking your phone before bed is for us. So, how the hell did they sleep? What did they do when they woke up in the middle of total darkness? And why would their sleep habits seem like something out of a psychological horror movie to us? The answer, as we'll see, combines human ingenuity, deep religious beliefs, superstitions that would make you laugh and cry at the same time, and a good dose of resignation to the reality of living without electricity, central heating, or Netflix. Get ready for a nighttime journey into the past, where you'll discover that the secrets of medieval sleep are much stranger, more fascinating, and let's say less hygienic than you ever imagined. This is, after all, history to keep you awake. So, get comfortable, adjust your modern pillow, and silently thank your lucky stars you don't live in the 12th century. Let's start with the most bewildering concept of all, biphasic sleep. Yes, you read that right. In the Middle Ages, sleeping straight through the night was as strange as finding a dragon in the village market. People didn't turn off the light, because there literally wasn't a switch. They went to bed around 9 or 10 at night, slept for about 3 or 4 hours, and then, as if they had an internal alarm programmed, they woke up. And we're not talking about an accidental awakening from a nightmare or needing to use the bathroom. No. They woke up because that's just how things worked. This period of nighttime wakefulness, known in some historical texts simply as the watch, could last between 1 and 2 hours. And what did they do during that time? This is where things get interesting, because the answer depended entirely on who you were and where you lived. Peasants, those tireless workers who made up the vast majority of the population, used this time for practical tasks. They got up to throw wood on the fire, which had to be kept burning all night to avoid freezing. They checked on the livestock, because in the middle of a medieval winter, a hungry wolf or desperate thief could wipe out your means of survival. Some even took the opportunity to chew on some stale bread and drink water, because the next day's work required energy. Monks, for their part, saw this vigil as a divine opportunity. In monasteries, the rules were strict. The sleep schedule was completely regulated by the canonical hours, that system of prayers that divided day and night into sacred segments. Monks got up for the office of matins, which could be at 2 or 3 in the morning, prayed in the cold darkness of their cells or in the monastery chapel, and then went back to sleep. For them, interrupting sleep was a form of spiritual discipline, a way to demonstrate their devotion to God through the sacrifice of rest. Imagine getting up every night at 3 in the morning to pray for an hour. And no, there was no coffee to stay awake afterward. The nobles, those privileged folks who lived in stone castles with fireplaces and servants, also participated in biphasic sleep, but with a more mundane twist. During the vigil, couples could chat by candlelight, plan political strategies, discuss marriage alliances for their children, or, according to some fairly explicit historical records, engage in more intimate activities. Yes, the Middle Ages weren't as puritanical as we've been led to believe. In fact, some doctors of the time recommended nighttime relations during the vigil as beneficial for health and the balance of bodily humors. So if you thought medieval life was all chastity and prayers, think again. This biphasic sleep pattern wasn't an isolated oddity from some specific region. Historians have found references to it in texts from all over Europe: England, France, Italy, Spain, Germany. From monastic chronicles to court records, divided sleep appears again and again as something completely normal. In a famous English case from the 14th century, a man was accused of stealing chickens at 2 in the morning. Why is the time relevant? Because there were witnesses awake who saw him. Witnesses who were simply living their normal nighttime vigil, probably stoking the fire or chatting with their families. Medieval literature is full of references to biphasic sleep, though we often overlook them without understanding their significance. Geoffrey Chaucer, in his 14th century Canterbury Tales, mentions characters who wake up in the middle of the night and spend time reflecting or conversing. In medieval ballads and romances, lovers often meet during these nighttime vigil hours when the rest of the castle sleeps but they're awake in their first or second sleep cycle. Legal records provide fascinating evidence of this practice. In medieval courts, when witnesses were asked about the exact time of a crime or event, they frequently mentioned the period between first and second sleep as a recognizable time marker. They didn't simply say midnight, they said during the watch or after first sleep, and everyone understood exactly what time they meant. Seasonal differences also affected this pattern. In summer, with shorter nights, the sleep periods were briefer, but the intermediate vigil persisted. In winter, with 16 hours of darkness in northern latitudes, people could sleep 2 blocks of 4 or 5 hours each, with an extended vigil in the middle. This seasonal flexibility is something we've completely lost with our rigid modern schedules. Urban artisans used the nighttime vigil to plan their next day's work. Bakers, who had to start their batches before dawn, often used this time to prepare dough or check their ovens. Blacksmiths mentally mapped out the complex projects they'd face the next day. It was a time of silent reflection, a rare luxury in medieval daytime life that was filled with constant noise and activity. Medieval doctors, those wise men who based all their knowledge on the theories of Galen and the 4 humours, even endorsed this pattern. They argued that sleeping in 2 separate blocks was healthier for the body, allowing the humours to balance properly. Sure, they had no idea what circadian rhythms or melatonin were, but their collective intuition had reached a practical conclusion that worked for their lifestyle. Let's be honest, this biphasic sleep sounds exhausting by our modern standards, but for medieval people who lived according to the rhythm of the sun, without the light pollution of modern cities, without screens altering their melatonin production, it was simply natural. Their bodies were synchronized with darkness. When the sun set, activity decreased dramatically. There wasn't much to do without artificial light, so going to bed early was the logical option. And waking at midnight wasn't an annoying interruption, but a smooth transition between 2 rest cycles. Now, where did these people sleep? Because if you think they had individual bedrooms with soft beds and clean sheets, you're very wrong. The reality of medieval sleep was considerably more rustic and, let's say, socially shared than we could tolerate today. Peasants, who represented approximately 90% of the European medieval population, slept in conditions we'd consider uninhabitable today. Their homes were 1 or 2 room huts, with mud and straw walls, thatched roofs and packed dirt floors. The bed, if you could call it that, was a pallet filled with straw, hay or, in the luckiest cases, coarse wool. This primitive mattress was placed directly on the dirt floor or on a basic wooden frame, barely elevated a few inches. Straw, though abundant and cheap, had its problems. With constant use, it flattened until it became a hard, uncomfortable surface. Worse still, it became a thriving ecosystem for fleas, bedbugs, lice, and other insects that saw human warmth and organic matter as paradise. Changing the straw was a periodic task, but not as frequent as one would hope. In winter, when every resource counted and agricultural work decreased, people tended to postpone these maintenance tasks. So, yes, they slept in what was basically an insect farm. But they didn't sleep alone. Oh no. Privacy, that concept so valued in our time, was a non-existent luxury for peasants. The whole family shared the same sleeping space. Parents, children, grandparents, uncles, all crammed into the same room. Babies slept with their mothers, small children cuddled between their siblings, and teenagers learned from a very young age that grandpa's snoring and uncle's nighttime gas were part of the family soundtrack. And here's the best part. In many peasant houses, especially in the colder regions of northern Europe, animals also shared the living space. Chickens, goats, sometimes even pigs or a cow, slept in the same room as the humans. Why? Because the animal's body heat helped maintain the home's temperature during freezing winter nights. It was a practical survival solution. Sure, it also meant sleeping with the smell of manure, wet fur, and that general barn aroma that permeated everything. But when the alternative was freezing to death, a little goat smell was an acceptable price. The nobles, of course, had a considerably more comfortable lifestyle, though not as much as we'd like to imagine. In castles and mansions, beds were structures of solid wood, often elaborately carved as a status symbol. These beds were raised off the ground, not just for aesthetics, but to avoid the humidity that accumulated on stone floors and to maintain some distance from rats and other critters that scurried around at night. The construction of these noble beds was itself an impressive feat of carpentry. The bedposts could be carved with family coats of arms, religious figures, or intricate geometric patterns. The headboard, often the most elaborate part, could include painted panels or inlays of precious materials in the most luxurious cases. These beds weren't simply furniture, they were statements of power and wealth that were sometimes passed down from generation to generation as valuable family heirlooms. The process of preparing a noble bed for the night was a ceremony in itself. Servants dedicated specifically to this task, called chamberlains in some places, had precise responsibilities. First, they checked the mattress, fluffing the feathers or wool to ensure an even surface. Then they spread linen sheets which had to be clean and wrinkle-free. Blankets were stacked according to the season, more in winter, fewer in summer. Finally, they closed the curtains partially, leaving them ready to be fully closed once the lord or lady retired. In royal courts, the bedtime ceremony, known as the coucher in French, was a structured social event. The king or queen retired, surrounded by select courtiers, and there was a specific order of who had the privilege of being present. Helping the monarch prepare for sleep was a coveted honor that reflected political closeness. These ceremonies could last an hour or more, with subtle political conversations intertwined with the rituals of undressing and putting on sleepwear. The concept of a private bedroom was itself quite fluid among the nobility. Although a lord might have his main chamber, it wasn't uncommon for trusted servants to sleep in the same room, on pallets on the floor, ready to attend to any nighttime needs. Ladies-in-waiting slept near their mistresses, sometimes in the same room or an adjacent one. The small children of nobles often had wet nurses who slept in their rooms until they reached a certain age. Castles, with their multiple levels and rooms, had a clear hierarchy of who slept where. The rooms on the upper floors, furthest from the noise and activity of the courtyard, were reserved for the noble family. Rooms with fireplaces were the most coveted, especially in winter. Important guests received rooms according to their rank, and there were complex protocols about where to lodge different levels of visiting nobility. High-ranking servants, like the steward or chamberlain, might have their own small rooms, a considerable luxury. Middle-ranking servants slept in rooms shared with others of their same level, and low-ranking servants, along with garrison soldiers, slept in communal spaces that transformed each night. The colchones of the nobles could be stuffed with feathers, quality wool, or even a mix of finer materials. However, don't imagine a modern spring or foam mattress. These mattresses were still fundamentally stuffed fabric sacks, which flattened over time and required regular fluffing. The sheets were made of linen, a material appreciated for its relative softness and ability to absorb moisture, though washing it regularly was another story. The most distinctive feature of noble beds were the canopies and curtains. These weren't simply decorative, they served vital functions. The thick fabric curtains, often lined with furs in winter, created an enclosed space around the bed. This micro-environment trapped body heat, functioning as a kind of personal tent inside the room. In a stone castle where drafts were constant and fireplaces didn't heat uniformly, these curtains could make the difference between a tolerable night and a night of freezing misery. Additionally, the curtains provided privacy, something crucial when we consider that, even in noble castles, rooms weren't always private spaces. It wasn't unusual for several family members, trusted servants, or even important guests to share the same chamber. In castles, space was a limited resource, and modern notions of personal privacy simply didn't exist in the same way. Lords and ladies could retire behind their bed curtains, creating a small refuge of intimacy in a world where being constantly surrounded by people was the norm. The servants and soldiers who lived in castles had a very different experience. They slept in the great hall, in communal rooms, or even in the corridors and corners of the castle. Their beds were straw or rag pallets spread directly on the stone floor. At night, these communal spaces transformed into makeshift dormitories with dozens of people lying side by side. Shared body heat was again a survival strategy, like a colony of penguins in Antarctica, but with less dignity and more smell of unwashed humanity. The noise was another factor that made medieval sleep a very different experience from ours. In a peasant house, nighttime sounds included the crackling of the fire that had to be kept lit, the wind blowing through cracks in the walls, animals moving and making their natural noises, and the collective snoring of an entire family. In castles, the situation wasn't much better. Hunting dogs barked, guards coughed and conversed on their rounds, wooden floorboards creaked under the weight of someone going to the bathroom, and occasionally you'd hear the distant wail of someone with a toothache or nightmares. In monasteries, where one might expect silence and tranquility, noise was also a problem. Bells rang multiple times during the night to call for religious offices. Matins, lauds, nighttime prayers interrupted the sleep not only of monks, but of any soul living near the monastery. And the monks themselves, walking through stone corridors in their sandals, coughing in the cold night, or whispering prayers, created their own symphony of sounds. And what about dreams? Because for medieval people, what happened while you slept was as important, if not more so, than the physical act of resting. Dreams weren't simply the random processing of a brain releasing the day's tensions. No. Dreams were divine messages, prophecies, warnings from beyond, or even visits from spirits and demons. Dream interpretation was a serious and widespread practice. There were complete manuals dedicated to deciphering the hidden meanings of nocturnal visions. These dream books, many of them based on texts from classical antiquity, catalogued symbols and their interpretations. For example, dreaming of clean, crystalline water was generally a good omen, a sign of health and prosperity to come. Dreaming of murky or stagnant water, on the other hand, foretold illness or problems. A dream with a wolf could mean an enemy was stalking you, while dreaming of a lamb indicated innocence or the need to protect someone vulnerable. These dream interpretation manuals had diverse origins, some derived from classical Greek and Roman texts, like Artemidorus's Onerocritica from the 2nd century, which was widely copied and circulated in medieval monasteries. Others had roots in biblical traditions, recalling how Joseph interpreted Pharaoh's dreams in the Old Testament, or how Daniel deciphered King Nebuchadnezzar's visions. This combination of pagan and Christian wisdom created a complex, syncretic system of interpretation. Dream symbols had specific meanings that any educated person knew. Dreaming of birds flying high signaled freedom and success in future projects. Dreaming of dead or injured birds foretold failures or betrayals. Fire in dreams was particularly significant. A controlled, luminous fire represented passion, vital energy, and spiritual purification, while an uncontrolled fire that devoured everything symbolized destruction, divine wrath, or imminent conflicts. Dreams about food also had codified interpretations. Dreaming of an abundant banquet could mean prosperity to come, but could also be interpreted as spiritual gluttony or temptation. Dreaming of hunger or rotten food was clearly negative, foretelling difficult times or illness. Bread, the sacred symbol of Christ's body, had especially religious connotations in dreams. Church authorities had an ambivalent relationship with dream interpretation. On one hand, the Bible was full of divine prophetic dreams that had guided God's people. On the other hand, there was concern that relying too much on dreams could border on superstition or even witchcraft. The Church distinguished between true dreams that came from God and false dreams that came from the devil or simply from poor digestion. St. Thomas Aquinas, the great 13th century theologian, wrote extensively about dreams in his Summa Theologica. He argued that some dreams were natural, caused by bodily humours or the day's concerns. Others were supernatural, sent by God as revelations, or by demons as temptations. The key was discerning what type of dream you'd had, and this required spiritual wisdom and often consultation with a confessor or religious guide. Medieval mystics had especially intense dream experiences. Hildegard of Bingen described complex visions she experienced in altered states of consciousness, many of which occurred during sleep or in the moments just before sleeping or waking. These visions included elaborate symbolic images that she interpreted as divine messages about theology, medicine, and morality. Her writings include detailed illustrations of these visions, showing cosmic structures, angelic figures, and abstract representations of theological concepts. Julian of Norwich, the 14th century English mystic, experienced a series of visions during a serious illness. These revelations of divine love occurred in a state between waking and sleeping, and she spent the rest of her life interpreting and writing about them. For mystics, sleep was a privileged state where the veil between the mundane and the divine became thin, allowing direct encounters with the sacred. In the secular realm, warriors and knights also paid attention to their dreams before important battles. There are numerous historical accounts of commanders who changed their military plans based on premonitory dreams. Duke William of Normandy, before invading England in 1066, reported having dreams he interpreted as favourable signs from God for his enterprise. His victory at the Battle of Hastings was later cited as proof that his dreams had been truly prophetic. Dreams also played a role in matrimonial matters. A young noblewoman who dreamed of her future husband before meeting him could interpret this as a sign of divine compatibility. Parents arranging marriages sometimes considered their children's dreams as a way to discern God's will about the proposed union. In some cases, marriages were cancelled if one of the participants had persistently negative dreams about the union. Medicine also intertwined with dreams. Medieval doctors believed that dreams could reveal information about a patient's health state. An experienced physician might ask a patient about their recent dreams as part of the diagnosis. Dreaming of falls or drowning could indicate an imbalance in the humors. Dreaming of specific colors also had medical significance. Excessive red in dreams could indicate too much sanguine humor, while black suggested melancholy or an excess of black bile. Nobles and kings took their dreams with a seriousness that would seem absurd to us today. There are historical records of battles postponed, political alliances cancelled, and marriages arranged or broken based on dream interpretations. A noble who dreamed of ravens before a battle could interpret this as a bad omen and decide to wait for a more propitious day. A king who dreamed of a crown falling into water could see this as a divine warning about his reign and take measures to strengthen his political position. Monks and clerics kept dream journals, meticulously noting their nocturnal visions and seeking signs from God in them. Some dreams were interpreted as divine calls to perform certain actions, change behavior, or undertake pilgrimages. Saint Hildegard of Bingen, the famous medieval mystic, based much of her theological and musical work on visions she experienced, many of which occurred in states between sleep and waking. But not all dreams were divine messages. There was also constant fear of nightmares, and in the medieval mindset, a nightmare wasn't simply a bad dream. It was potentially a visit from the devil. The word itself, nightmare, has roots suggesting an evil being that sits on your chest while you sleep, oppressing you and filling your mind with terrors. In some European cultures, there was belief in creatures like the incubus and succubus, demons that visited people while they slept in ways I won't detail here, but which caused great anxiety. To protect themselves from these nighttime threats, medieval people developed a whole arsenal of protective practices. Praying before sleep wasn't just a pious custom, it was a defensive necessity. The Our Father, the Hail Mary, and other prayers were recited as verbal shields against dark forces. Some placed wooden or metal crosses near their beds or hung them on walls. Herbs also played an important role. Lavender, rosemary, and rue were considered protective plants that could drive away evil spirits. Small sachets of these herbs were sewn and placed under the pillow or hung near the bed. In some regions, there were specific amulets against nightmares. Stones with natural holes, known in some cultures as hag stones, were hung over beds. It was believed these holes confused evil spirits, trapping them in an infinite loop as they tried to pass through the hole. It sounds absurd to us, but for a medieval person terrified by recurring nightmares, having this stone was real psychological comfort. Even sleeping position was subject to debate and superstition. Medieval doctors, following Galen's theories about the four humors, recommended sleeping on your right side. They argued this position aided digestion, allowing the stomach to process food more efficiently during the night. Sleeping on your left side was considered less ideal, though not dangerous. But sleeping on your back, that was problematic. It was believed this position facilitated nightmares and, more worryingly, left the sleeper vulnerable to demonic attacks. The idea was that, lying on your back, your chest and soul were exposed, like a fortress with its gates open. Sleeping face down also had its critics. Some religious moralists considered this position sinful or indecent, associating it with impure behaviors. Additionally, practically speaking, sleeping face down on an irregular straw pallet wasn't exactly comfortable. So most people, following medical advice and superstitions, slept on their side, curled up to conserve body heat. And speaking of conserving heat, sleepwear, or the lack of it, is another fascinating aspect. Today we take our soft cotton pajamas for granted, but in the Middle Ages, most people didn't have specific clothing for sleeping. peasants simply slept in their linen undergarments, the same garment they'd worn during the day. This garment, a kind of long shirt that reached the knees or below, provided a basic layer of protection against the cold. The poorest, however, sometimes slept fully dressed with all their layers of clothing on, simply because they didn't have enough spare clothing to afford changing. Imagine working all day in the field, coming home exhausted and simply throwing yourself on your straw pallet in the same sweaty, dirt-filled tunic. Doesn't sound very hygienic, right? But when the concept of personal hygiene was radically different from ours, this was simply normal. Nobles could afford nightshirts, long garments of linen, or even silk for the richest, designed specifically for sleeping. These nightshirts could be embroidered or decorated, though most were simple and practical. Sleeping caps were also common among those who could afford them. They weren't a fashion whim, but a practical necessity. The head loses more body heat than any other part of the body, so keeping it covered during the night helped conserve temperature. Imagine a brave knight, hero of tournaments and battles, huddled under his blankets with a pointy wool cap. It's not the most heroic image, but definitely practical. In monasteries, monks slept in their habits. Monastic rules, especially the strictest ones like the Cistercians, emphasized austerity. Taking off clothes to sleep was considered an unnecessary concession to physical comfort. Some monks even slept on hard boards without any mattress, as a form of bodily mortification and spiritual discipline. Saint Dominic of Guzman, founder of the Dominican order, was famous for sleeping on his cell floor with no more comfort than his habit and perhaps a stone as a pillow. This, of course, was considered admirable and worthy of imitation by other devout monks. Hey, if you're enjoying this journey through medieval nights, subscribe to our YouTube channel. We have more fascinating stories about how people lived, ate, loved and survived in past eras. Hit the subscribe button and turn on notifications so you don't miss any historical secrets. Let's return to the medieval night, because the environment itself, regardless of where you slept or with whom, was something that deserves special attention. Total darkness is something most of us never truly experience. We live in a world of constant light pollution, with street lights, screens, and that LED light from your phone charger glowing in the dark. But in the Middle Ages, when the sun set, the darkness was absolute and profound. Artificial lighting was expensive and limited. Candles were a luxury. Beeswax candles, which burned cleanly with a pleasant aroma, were extremely expensive and mainly reserved for churches and the wealthiest homes. Tallow candles, made from animal fat, were more accessible but had their problems. They smelled terrible when burning, giving off greasy smoke that permeated everything. Plus, they melted quickly and provided dim, flickering light. Oil lamps were another option, running on olive oil in the south or fish oil in the north. But again, cost and availability limited their use. For most peasants, keeping a light burning all night was simply unthinkable. The oil or tallow needed to do so represented valuable resources that were reserved for truly necessary moments. So what did people do when they needed to get up in the middle of the night? Basically, they navigated by groping in total darkness. Houses were small, and familiarity with the space allowed movement without too much stumbling. In castles, some nobles kept a candle burning in a candlestick near the bed, but this carried risks. A knocked-over candlestick could start a fire, and in a building full of tapestries, curtains, wood and straw, a fire was a potentially deadly catastrophe. Fire was another constant element in the medieval nighttime environment. In peasant houses, the central hearth fire had to be kept burning throughout the night, especially in winter. Letting it go out meant being cold, but also meant the arduous task of rekindling it in the morning. Starting a fire without modern matches or lighters required flint, steel, tinder, and lots of patience. So someone, usually a woman or servant, had the responsibility of getting up periodically to add wood. This fire provided some light, a dancing, changing light that created moving shadows on the walls. In a world without stable electric lights, these flickering shadows fed the imagination and superstitions. It's not hard to understand why medieval people believed in ghosts and spirits when every night the shadows seemed to come alive on their own. Smoke was also a constant companion. In more primitive houses, smoke from the fire simply rose toward the roof, where it eventually escaped through a hole or filtered through the thatch. This meant the indoor air was constantly smoke-filled, smoke that stung the eyes, irritated the throat, and stuck to clothes and hair. Even in castles with chimneys, the draft wasn't always perfect, and smoke could back up, filling rooms with an acrid smell. Nighttime sounds also deserve special mention. In the countryside, darkness brought a symphony of noises that would seem unsettling to us today. Owls hooting, wolves howling in the distance, wind blowing through trees, branches creaking. For a medieval person, these sounds were familiar, but no less disturbing. Wolves were a real threat to livestock, and in times of famine, they could even attack humans. Nighttime howls weren't just ambient sound. They were reminders of tangible dangers. In medieval cities, which grew especially during the 12th and 13th centuries, nighttime sounds were different in nature, but equally disturbing. Narrow streets amplified any noise. Drunks leaving taverns, cats fighting, stray dogs barking, night watchmen making their rounds and announcing the hours with bells or shouts. Sleeping in a medieval urban house meant being exposed to this constant background noise. Nighttime physiological needs also presented their own unique challenges. There were no flush toilets or indoor plumbing. In peasant houses, if you needed to urinate in the middle of the night, you basically had two options. Go outside, risking the cold, darkness, and potentially thieves or animals, or use a chamber pot, a simple ceramic or metal vessel kept in the room and emptied in the morning. Chamber pots were extremely common at all social levels. From the poorest peasants to the most powerful kings, everyone used chamber pots during the night. In castles, chamber pots could be of better quality, even decorated, but the function was the same. In the morning, servants had the ungrateful task of emptying these containers, usually throwing their contents into the castle latrines or, in cities, directly into the streets. Yes, you read that right. In medieval cities, it was common practice to throw human waste out windows onto the street. Generally, a warning was shouted first, something like, "Gardy-loo," but accidents were frequent. Medieval city streets were, in many cases, open sewers. And this environment, naturally, affected the air quality and the experience of living there. For greater needs, peasant houses rarely had indoor latrines. There were cesspits outside, or people simply used the surrounding fields. In castles, latrines were more sophisticated, consisting of small rooms with wooden seats that had holes. Waste fell through a chute that usually ended in the castle moat, or a drainage pit. Some castle latrines were incredibly well designed, with multiple seats side by side, because privacy during these bodily functions wasn't a priority. Using the latrine in the middle of a cold, winter night was an experience that required true necessity. Imagine getting out of your relatively warm bed, walking through freezing stone corridors, in almost total darkness, to sit on a frozen wooden seat with an icy wind blowing from the hole. No wonder chamber pots were so popular. Nighttime hygiene, or the lack of it, also influenced the sleep experience. Most people didn't wash before going to bed. Water had to be hauled from wells or rivers. Heating it was a laborious process, and the idea of washing your entire body wasn't something done frequently. Peasants might wash their face and hands after a day's work, but that was it. Nobles had access to servants who could prepare hot water, but even they bathed rarely, maybe once a month or less. This meant people went to bed with the sweat, dirt, and odors of the day stuck to their skin. Beds, over time, absorbed these odors. Straw pallets became impregnated with sweat, and without regular washing of bedding, which required enormous amounts of water and effort, the odors accumulated. To our modern sensibility, a medieval bedroom would have been an olfactory assault, but for them, it was simply the smell of humanity. Insects were inevitable nighttime companions. Fleas infested straw pallets and wool blankets. Lice lived in hair and clothing. Bedbugs hid in cracks of wooden beds and came out at night to feed. These parasites weren't just annoying, causing constant itching, but also transmitted diseases. The bubonic plague, which devastated Europe in multiple waves during the Middle Ages, was transmitted by fleas that traveled on rats. Fighting these insects was a constant and usually losing battle. Blankets were shaken out, straw was changed, herbs like rue or tansy that were believed to repel fleas were applied, but complete elimination was impossible. Scratching at night was so common it was barely noticed, and bite marks covered the bodies of almost everyone, from peasants to kings. Children deserve a special section in this exploration of medieval sleep. Babies and small children slept with their parents, not just for lack of space, but for safety and warmth. Nighttime nursing was necessary, and keeping the baby close facilitated this. However, this practice had tragic risks. Historical records mention cases of babies who lost their lives during the night, accidentally suffocated when a parent, deeply asleep after an exhausting day of work, rolled onto them. This problem was so recognized that the church began speaking out against co-sleeping, warning parents about the dangers. Some priests preached that allowing a baby to sleep in the parent's bed was sinful negligence. However, for many families, especially the poorest, there was no practical alternative. They didn't have separate cribs, and shared body heat was vital for the baby's survival in cold winters. Older children slept together, often several on the same pallet. Siblings squeezed together to share warmth, a practice that continued even in noble families. In castles, it was common for male children to share a room, while daughters shared another. Children learned from a very young age that personal space was a flexible concept. For children of peasant families, the night could be terrifying. Stories of wolves, forest spirits, and supernatural creatures were told around the fire, and when darkness fell, these stories came alive in children's imaginations. A child lying in total darkness, listening to the strange sounds of the night, could easily convince themselves that something dangerous was lurking. Parents, of course, tried to console children with prayers and blessings, teaching them that God would protect them from nighttime evils. In noble families, wet nurses played an important role in nighttime care of children. A wet nurse, usually a lower-class woman hired to breastfeed and care for a noble family's baby, slept near the child, responding to their needs during the night. These women, separated from their own children to serve wealthier families, spent interrupted nights attending to babies who weren't theirs, a harsh reality of medieval life. Now let's broaden our view to regional differences, because Europe in the Middle Ages was a mosaic of cultures, climates, and customs. In the south, in regions like Spain, Italy, and southern France, where summers were hot and winters milder, sleep patterns had their particularities. The siesta, that practice so associated with Mediterranean cultures, already existed in the Middle Ages. During the summer months, when the midday sun was scorching, working in the fields was dangerous and exhausting. Peasants developed the custom of working early in the morning, resting during the hottest hours of the day, and then resuming work in the afternoon when the sun lowered. This siesta wasn't a lazy luxury, it was a survival strategy. Sleeping briefly during the day allowed the body to recover from extreme heat and continue working until nightfall. In Northern Europe, in Scandinavia, England, Germany, and the Baltic regions, winters were brutally cold, and nights extremely long. In the depths of winter, the sun could rise late and set early, leaving 16 or more hours of darkness. During these months, people slept much more, simply because there wasn't much else to do. Agricultural work was impossible with frozen ground, and going outside was dangerous. Families huddled in their homes, keeping the fire burning and sleeping long hours to conserve energy and warmth. This also meant less food consumed, which was important when winter food reserves were limited. Sleeping more was literally a way to stretch food supplies. In these cold regions, animal furs were essential for sleep. Bear, wolf, deer, and sheep furs were used as blankets. These furs, though not exactly hygienic by our standards, provided excellent insulation. A family with enough animal furs had a significant advantage for surviving winter. Cultural differences also manifested in sleep-related superstitions. In the Celtic regions of Ireland, Scotland, and Wales, there were particular beliefs about fairies and nature spirits. It was believed fairies could kidnap people while they slept, taking them to the fairy realm. To prevent this, iron amulets were placed near beds, as fairies were thought to fear iron. In Germanic regions, there were superstitions about Alpe, or Maren, spirits that sat on sleepers' chests, causing sleep paralysis and nightmares. These beliefs weren't mere folk tales, people really took them seriously. Talismans, runes, and specific prayers were used for protection. In Spain and Portugal, with their long history of contact with the Islamic world, there were Arab influences in some sleep-related practices. The Moors had brought advanced medical knowledge, including ideas about sleep hygiene and the importance of rest. In the reconquered regions, some of these practices persisted, though Christianized. If you're enjoying this tour through medieval nights and want to discover more secrets of the past, subscribe to our channel. We have videos about how they ate, how they fell in love, and how our ancestors survived. Hit the subscribe button and don't miss any fascinating stories. Now let's talk about remedies for insomnia. Because yes, medieval people also suffered from inability to sleep, and their solutions were a fascinating mix of practical herbalism and delusional superstition. Insomnia wasn't seen simply as an annoyance. It was interpreted as a sign of spiritual or physical imbalance. It could be the result of an unconfessed sin, a tormented soul, an imbalance of bodily humors, or even a curse. Herbal remedies were the first line of defense. Valerian was known for its sedative properties, and valerian root infusions were drunk before bed. The smell was unpleasant, described by some as similar to dirty socks, but it was believed effective. Chamomile, still popular today as a relaxing tea, was also widely used. Lavender, lemon balm, and hops were other common herbs in sleep remedies. But then there were the more exotic and, frankly, absurd remedies. Some medieval doctors recommended drinking wine mixed with extracts of sedative plants, which makes some sense. But others suggested mixtures that included ingredients like eel bile, bat blood, or powders made from specific animal parts. One particularly colorful remedy suggested rubbing your feet with bear grease before bed, under the theory that the bear, an animal that sleeps deeply during winter, could transfer this ability. It's unclear how many of these remedies actually worked, beyond the placebo effect. But in an era without scientific methods to test treatment efficacy, people were willing to try anything that offered the promise of a night's rest. Another method to combat insomnia was prayer and confession. If sleeplessness was believed to result from sin or a guilty conscience, then confessing sins and receiving absolution could, in theory, restore sleep. Priests often advised insomniacs to pray rosaries, do penances, or even make pilgrimages to sacred shrines. Bloodletting was also used to treat insomnia under humoral theory. If insomnia was thought caused by excess blood or humoral imbalance, a barber surgeon could perform a bloodletting, extracting a certain amount of blood from the patient. This, supposedly, would restore balance and allow sleep. In reality, blood loss probably simply weakened the patient to the point of exhaustion, inducing sleep through sheer fatigue. Hot baths, when they could be managed, were also recommended. Hot water relaxed muscles and prepared the body for rest. Some monasteries had communal baths where monks could periodically immerse themselves, and these baths were sometimes prescribed specifically to help with sleep problems. However, as we already mentioned, frequent bathing wasn't the norm, and most people didn't have access to enough hot water. Music also played a role in inducing sleep. Lullabies aren't a modern invention. In the Middle Ages, mothers sang to their babies to help them sleep. Some of these melodies have survived in folklore. For adults, soft music from the lute or flute, played by a minstrel in a noble castle, could help create an atmosphere conducive to sleep during the nighttime vigil. Bedtime rituals were important. As we mentioned, prayers were universal. But there were other specific rituals. Some people made the sign of the cross over their bed before lying down. Others sprinkled holy water in the corners of the room. In some cultures, a candle was left burning next to a sacred image, as protection during the night. Bed orientation was also considered important. We already mentioned that sleeping with your head toward the north was associated with death, but there were also beliefs about the best orientation for healthy sleep. Some thought sleeping with your head toward the east, toward Jerusalem, was propitious, aligning with the sacred direction. Personal objects could also function as sleep talismans. A blessed rosary kept under the pillow, a saint's relic, or even a special stone found in a sacred place could provide psychological comfort. For a medieval person whose worldview was saturated with the supernatural, these objects had real power. Now let's expand our view to monasteries in more detail, because monastic life offered a unique and extreme sleep experience. Monks and nuns lived according to strict rules that regulated every aspect of their life, including sleep. The rule of St. Benedict, written in the 6th century but widely followed throughout the Middle Ages, specified precise schedules for sleep and waking. Monks went to bed early, generally shortly after compline, the last office of the day celebrated at nightfall. They slept in individual cells in the wealthier monasteries or in communal dormitories in the poorer ones. Monastic cells were austere spaces with a simple bed, sometimes barely a wooden bench with a thin mattress, a small window, and perhaps a crucifix on the wall. At 2 or 3 in the morning, bells rang for matins. Monks had to get up immediately, no matter how deeply they were sleeping. In the depths of winter, this meant getting up in a freezing cell, quickly dressing in cold habits and walking barefoot or in sandals through stone corridors to the chapel. There, they sang psalms and hymns for an hour or more before returning to their cells to sleep another couple hours until Lauds, the dawn office. This fragmented sleep pattern was exhausting. Monks lived in a perpetual state of sleep deprivation, which some orders considered a form of bodily mortification, a way to master the flesh and draw closer to God. However, it also caused real problems. Monks fell asleep during offices, their heads falling forward as they tried to stay awake singing psalms. Some monasteries had specific rules about how to punish monks who fell asleep during prayers. Nuns lived under similar rules, though some female orders were slightly less strict with nighttime schedules. However, nuns also got up to pray during the night, interrupting their sleep in service to God. For women who had entered the convent very young, this rhythm of life was all they knew. Monastic hospitals, which cared for the sick and pilgrims, presented additional challenges. Monk or nun nurses had to be available throughout the night to attend to patients. Sleep was taken in shifts, with different people covering for each other. In these hospitals, the sound of coughing, groans of pain, and the snoring of the sick created a constant nighttime cacophony. The life of pilgrims also deserves attention. During the Middle Ages, hundreds of thousands of people undertook pilgrimages to sacred places like Santiago de Compostela, Rome, or Jerusalem. These journeys could last months or even years. Pilgrims slept where they could, in pilgrim hospitals run by monasteries, in inns when they could afford them, or simply outdoors. Sleeping outdoors during a pilgrimage was a raw experience. Pilgrims wrapped themselves in their cloaks, used their backpacks as pillows, and tried to find a place sheltered from the wind. Groups traveled together for safety, sleeping close to one another. Wolves, bandits, and inclement weather were real threats. Many pilgrims never reached their destination, losing their lives along the way to illness, accidents, or violence. Inns offered somewhat more comfort, but not much. A typical medieval inn had few private rooms, reserved for the wealthiest travelers. Most guests slept in a common room, on pallets, arranged on the floor, often sharing space with complete strangers. Fleas, lice, and thieves were common problems. Innkeepers had a reputation for being dishonest, overcharging or stealing from guests while they slept. Sleeping in a medieval inn meant being constantly alert. Travelers often slept with their most valuable possessions hidden in their clothing or under their body. Some even tied their bags to their wrists to prevent nighttime theft. And the noise. Always the noise. Inns were boisterous places, with drinkers downstairs, shouted conversations, occasional fights, and the constant coming and going of people. Merchants who traveled for business had similar experiences. Transporting valuable goods meant they were targets for thieves. Merchants often traveled in caravans, sleeping in shifts so someone was always watching. In commercial cities, they could afford better accommodations, but on rural roads, options were limited. Soldiers and mercenaries had their own sleep experience, especially during military campaigns. An army on the march slept in temporary camps, with soldiers sleeping in tents if they were lucky, or simply outdoors if not. The terrain could be wet, cold, or hard. Armor was removed for sleep, but weapons were always close. Sentries kept watch during the night, and the risk of surprise attack meant sleep was light and interrupted. During sieges, both attackers and defenders suffered from chronic sleep deprivation. Defenders in a besieged castle had to maintain constant watches on the walls. Attackers had to be prepared to respond to defensive sallies at any moment. Weeks or months of this continuous stress exhausted both sides, and lack of sleep contributed to tactical errors and collapse of morale. If you're fascinated by discovering these details about real life in the past, don't forget to subscribe to the channel. We have tons more content about military history, daily life, and the lesser-known aspects of ancient eras. Hit the button and join our community of history enthusiasts. Now let's explore some more specific aspects related to gender and sleep. The experiences of women and men, though sharing many similarities, also had important differences. Pregnant women faced particular challenges. Medieval doctors recommended they sleep more to preserve their health and the babies. However, they also gave strange advice, like avoiding certain foods before bed so as not to disturb the fetus, or sleeping in specific positions. Women who had just given birth went through a period called lying in, where they remained in bed or in their room for days or weeks. This time was supposed to be restful. But in reality, with a newborn needing constant feeding, sleep was extremely fragmented. Upper-class women had wet nurses to breastfeed the baby, allowing them more rest. Peasant women didn't have this luxury and had to get up every few hours to feed their children. The menstrual cycle also affected sleep. Though menstruation wasn't discussed openly in medieval society, women experienced cramps, discomfort, and bleeding that made rest difficult. Herbal remedies like fennel or mugwort were used to relieve symptoms, but effectiveness was limited. Widows and older women had different sleep experiences. Without small children to care for, and often living in multi-generational households where their daughters or daughters-in-law handled domestic tasks, some older women could sleep more. However, the illnesses and ailments of old age, without modern painkillers, caused pain that interrupted sleep. For men, exhausting physical work generally meant they slept deeply, despite uncomfortable conditions. A peasant who had worked from sunup to sundown in the fields fell into a deep sleep almost immediately upon lying down. Nobles with less physical work but more political and social concerns could suffer more from stress-related insomnia. Professional soldiers developed the ability to sleep anywhere and in any circumstance, a vital ability for survival. They could fall asleep standing during long watches, sleep on uncomfortable armor, or rest briefly between battles. This sleep adaptability was part of their training and experience. Age differences were also significant. The elderly in the Middle Ages, those who survived beyond 50 or 60 years, something rare given the life expectancy of the era, experienced sleep problems similar to today's elderly. Joint pain, breathing problems, and the frequent need to urinate interrupted their rest. However, in a society that valued the wisdom of elders, these old people often spent their sleepless nights telling stories to children who also couldn't sleep, passing on oral traditions. Adolescents and young adults with their bodies full of energy sometimes snuck out during the night for forbidden romantic encounters. Balconies of urban houses were meeting places for young lovers after curfew. These nighttime escapades were risky, since being caught out after curfew could result in punishment from authorities or parents. The mentally ill, in an era where mental illness was understood very little and often attributed to demonic possession or divine punishment, had tragic sleep experiences. Those who suffered from what we'd today call depression, anxiety, or sleep disorders were often chained, locked up, or sent on pilgrimages seeking miraculous cures. Sleep for them could be impossible, and their nighttime screams disturbed entire communities. But let's delve deeper into how the very architecture of medieval buildings influenced sleep. Castles, with their thick stone walls, offered protection against enemies, but created particular nighttime environments. Stone absorbed cold during the day and released it during the night, making rooms especially freezing after sundown. Walls could be 2 or 3 meters thick in the oldest fortresses, enough to stop any projectile, but also enough to turn each room into a natural freezer chamber. Windows in castles presented a constant dilemma. The oldest were simple arrow slits, narrow openings designed for archers that allowed shooting arrows while offering protection. These windows, though strategically brilliant, were thermally disastrous. Wind entered, whistling through them without mercy. Over time, especially in the 14th and 15th centuries, windows became larger in peacetime castles, but glass remained prohibitively expensive. When glass finally began appearing in windows, it was different from modern glass. Medieval glass was hand-blown, creating small, uneven panels held together with lead. This glass was often greenish or yellowish, full of bubbles and imperfections. It didn't insulate particularly well and distorted light. But hey, at least it blocked some wind. For most castles and All peasant houses, however, windows were simply covered with wooden shutters, hides, or oiled cloths that let through some light while providing more protection against the elements. Building orientation also played a role in nighttime comfort. Medieval builders, especially the monk architects who designed monasteries, intuitively understood concepts of passive design. Monastic dormitories were often oriented to capture southern sun during the day, warming walls that would then release that heat during the night. Main rooms in noble castles were often located on the south side, while storage and service spaces were placed to the north. Heating systems, when they existed beyond simple fireplaces, were fascinating innovations. Some more advanced castles had hypocaust heating systems, a technology inherited from the Romans. These systems worked by circulating hot air from a central fire under raised floors. However, they were expensive to build and maintain, and only the wealthiest lords could afford them. Most relied exclusively on fireplaces and portable braziers. Chimneys themselves evolved significantly during the Middle Ages. The earliest were simply holes in the roof where smoke escaped. Over time, chimneys embedded in walls became standard architectural features of quality buildings. These chimneys had flues that ascended through multiple floors, sometimes snaking ingeniously to heat several rooms with a single fire. The most sophisticated chimney drawers included baffles that improved airflow and reduced smoke backflow. However, even the best chimneys had limitations. When wind blew from certain directions, smoke could be forced back into the room. During storms, rain could fall down the chimney, creating clouds of steam and ash. And there was always the danger of chimney fire, when soot build-up in the flue ignited, potentially setting the entire building ablaze. The roofs of medieval constructions also affected the sleep experience. In peasant houses with thatched roofs, the material provided surprisingly good insulation when dry and well maintained. However, thatch could harbor all kinds of creatures: mice, birds, insects. It wasn't unusual to wake up with a spider hanging over your face or a mouse running across the beams. Thatched roofs were also extremely flammable, and nighttime fires caused by errant sparks from the chimney were a constant threat. In more prosperous buildings, clay or slate tiles replaced thatch. These roofs were more durable and fire-resistant, but also colder. They didn't provide the same insulation, and in winter, cold descended from the roof like an icy blanket. 2 or more story buildings had advantages here, since lower floors were somewhat insulated by upper ones. The concept of acoustic privacy was virtually non-existent. Wooden floors creaked and transmitted every footstep, every movement. In houses with multiple stories, you could hear perfectly everything happening in the room above or below. Interior walls, when they existed, were often simple wood or cloth partitions that didn't block sound at all. This meant snoring, nighttime conversations, baby cries, and other activities were audible to everyone in the house. Nighttime latrines deserve more detailed attention because they really were ingenious in their design. In castles, latrines, also called guard-robes, were often located in projections that jutted out from the exterior walls. This allowed waste to fall directly into the moat or a drainage pit below. These latrines could be incredibly cold, since they were essentially exposed to the outdoors, with only a wooden seat between you and the icy wind. Some castle latrines were surprisingly sophisticated. They had multiple seats, side by side, because using the bathroom was a social activity where people could converse. This seems strange to us today, but reflects different notions of privacy and modesty. Guard robes also served to store clothing, since it was believed the ammonia from urine repelled moths. So your best tunic might be hanging right next to the medieval toilet. In cities, public latrines existed over rivers or drainage canals. These communal facilities were used during the day, but at night, when streets were dangerous and dark, people relied on domestic chamber pots. Night soil collectors, specialized workers in some cities, went from house to house collecting the contents of cesspits and chamber pots, taking it outside the city walls. This was one of the least desirable but absolutely essential jobs for maintaining some urban hygiene. Artificial lighting, or its almost total absence, created a nighttime world we can barely imagine. Most people simply gave up when it got dark. Without nighttime entertainment as we know it, without accessible books for most, without any activity that could be easily done without light, sleeping was the logical option. The concept of nighttime productivity, so valued in our modern society, would have been absurd to a medieval peasant. In monasteries, however, the night was a time of intense spiritual activity. Monks had developed a complex system of canonical hours that structured every moment of day and night. Compline, the last office of the day, was celebrated at nightfall. Then came sleep until matins around 2 a.m. After matins, monks went back to sleep briefly until Lauds, the dawn office. This cycle repeated every night, year after year, decade after decade. Monasteries developed specific techniques to wake all monks simultaneously. Bells were the most common method, with bell towers positioned so their sound reached all dormitories. Some monasteries had a monk designated as the waker, whose job was to walk through dormitories striking a board or portable bell. This monk had to be especially resistant to sleep, since waking first in the freezing darkness of night required extraordinary discipline. Monks developed strategies to deal with constant sleep deprivation. Some slept briefly during the day when rules allowed. Others simply adapted, their bodies adjusting to the fragmented pattern until it became their new normal. However, monastic documents are full of complaints about monks falling asleep during offices, a perpetual problem that no amount of discipline or penance seemed to completely resolve. Gregorian chant, that distinctive singing associated with medieval monasteries, has an interesting relationship with sleep. Matins chants, sung in the deep darkness of night, had an ethereal quality. Male voices resonating in stone chapels, the prolonged echo of each note, darkness illuminated only by a few candles, all created an atmosphere between sleep and waking. Monks described altered states of consciousness during these nighttime offices, moments of profound spiritual connection that could only occur in that threshold between sleep and waking. The seasons of the year created radically different nighttime experiences. In summer, short nights meant fewer hours of darkness, but also heat that could be unbearable in rooms without ventilation. Medieval houses didn't have window screens, so opening windows to let in fresh air also meant inviting mosquitoes, flies, and other insects. People slept with veils over their faces, or with smoke from burning aromatic herbs to repel insects. In autumn, harvests meant extremely long days of exhausting physical work. Peasants literally collapsed on their pallets after working from before dawn until after dusk. Sleep in harvest season was deep and absolute, born of total exhaustion. There was no time or energy for elaborate rituals or nighttime vigils. Winter, as we already mentioned, brought its own extreme challenges, but it also brought more time for sleep. With up to 16 hours of darkness in northern latitudes and with little agricultural work possible, people slept much more. This wasn't necessarily pleasant. The cold made sleep uncomfortable, but it was a way to conserve energy and food. A sleeping person didn't need to eat, and when winter reserves ran low, sleeping more became a survival strategy. Spring brought renewal, but also illnesses. After long months confined in cramped spaces with poor ventilation, eating preserved foods of questionable quality, people emerged from winter weak and prone to diseases. Spring epidemics were common, and the sleep of the sick was interrupted by fever, coughing, and pain. Religious festivals also structured the year of sleep. During Lent, the 40-day period before Easter, devout Christians were expected to practice greater austerity, including less sleep, devoted to more prayer. Vigil nights before major festivals meant spending the entire night awake in church, praying and participating in religious services. Christmas and Easter were preceded by these nighttime vigils, where entire communities gathered in churches. Imagine a medieval church in the dead of winter night, illuminated by hundreds of candles, filled with faithful who'd been awake for hours, singing, praying, and waiting for the dawn that would mark the great feast. The smoke from candles and incense filling the air, exhaustion creating an almost trance-like state, voices rising in ancient hymns. It was a powerful communal experience that linked sleep or its absence with the sacred. If you want to keep discovering these fascinating aspects of medieval life, subscribe to our channel. We have videos about everything from food to battles, from love to death in the Middle Ages. Hit the button and don't miss any of our stories from the past. Nighttime travelers, though rare, also existed. Urgent messengers carrying important news sometimes traveled at night, changing horses at posts along the way. These men developed the ability to sleep in the saddle, taking brief naps while the horse continued at a trot. It was dangerous, exhausting, but sometimes necessary when the message was life or death. Smugglers and criminals, naturally, preferred the night for their activities. Poachers who stole game from lordly forests worked in darkness. Urban thieves took advantage of curfew when streets were empty and houses locked. Their nighttime world was one of tense silence, every sound amplified in the stillness, every shadow potentially a guard or witness. Prostitutes in medieval cities often worked at night, though prostitution was regulated and in some places confined to authorized brothels. These women saw the night from a unique perspective, observing the flow of men emerging from taverns, the seedy nightlife that existed in the margins of respectable society. Night watchmen in cities and castles had the tedious job of staying awake when their whole body screamed for sleep. They patrolled walls, streets and corridors, fighting against sleep that constantly threatened. Some developed techniques like walking constantly, never stopping or sitting. Others chewed, stimulating herbs, or threw cold water on their faces. Medieval stories are full of guards who fell asleep on duty, often with disastrous consequences when enemies or thieves took advantage. The chronically ill-faced nights of constant suffering. Without effective painkillers, conditions like arthritis, gout, kidney stones, or poorly healed wounds caused pain that made sleep nearly impossible. Families took turns caring for the sick during the night, applying compresses, praying, or simply offering company. Prolonged illness affected not only the patient, but the entire family, whose sleep was constantly interrupted. Childbirths, which occurred at home, assisted by midwives and family women, often happened at night. Labor could last hours or days, and nobody in the house slept during this time. The laboring woman's screams, the midwife's urgent instructions, the coming and going of hot water and cloths, all created an atmosphere of nighttime urgency. And afterward, if all went well, the cry of a new baby that would mark the beginning of many sleepless nights for new parents. Sailors and fishermen had their own unique sleep experiences. On small boats, they slept in shifts, always with someone awake watching the sea and sky. Hammocks, which became popular after European contact with America, didn't yet exist in medieval Europe. Sailors slept on hard benches or directly on the deck, wrapped in cloaks and canvas against the salty dampness. Fishermen who left before dawn to take advantage of the best fishing hours slept little and at odd times. They went to bed shortly after nightfall to get up at 3 or 4 in the morning, prepare their nets and boats, and be on the water when the sun barely began to light the horizon. Blacksmiths and bakers, artisans whose work required starting early, developed sleep patterns that preceded most of society. Bakers especially had to get up in the deep darkness of night to light their ovens, prepare dough, and have fresh bread ready when the town or city awakened. Some slept in their workshops, saving precious commuting time. The mentally ill, epileptics, those who suffered from what we'd today call sleep disorders, lived constant nightmares in a society that didn't understand their conditions. Some were chained at night to prevent them from hurting themselves or wandering. Others were confined in rooms or institutions. Their sleep experiences were of deprivation, fear, and confusion. The next time you complain because your mattress is too hard or because the neighbor makes noise, think about those medieval men and women who slept on flea-infested straw pallets, got up in the middle of the night to pray or stoke the fire, shared their space with animals and strangers, and navigated their nights in total darkness, surrounded by mysterious sounds and real threats. Their sleep habits, though strange to us, were perfectly logical within their context. Biphasic sleep took advantage of long nights without artificial light. Sleeping in groups conserved vital warmth. Prayers and rituals provided psychological comfort in a world full of incomprehensible dangers. And acceptance of discomfort was simply part of being human in an era without the modern comforts we take for granted. The Middle Ages, with all its oddities, fears, and superstitions, teaches us something important about human adaptability. People found ways to rest, to dream, to get up each morning and face a new day, despite conditions we today consider intolerable. Their nights were full of challenges, but also moments of human connection. Families huddled together, couples whispering in darkness, monks singing psalms under the stars, and children listening to stories by the fire. Perhaps, in our era of individual rooms, perfect mattresses, and artificial silence, we've lost something of that nighttime connection. Medieval people didn't sleep alone, physically or spiritually. Each night was a communal experience where the living, the dead, the saints and demons intertwined in the world of dreams. So as you lie down tonight in your comfortable bed with your ergonomic pillow and your room at perfect temperature, take a moment to think about those sleepers of the past. Their nights were darker, colder, noisier, and more dangerous than ours. But they were also more mysterious, more connected with the natural rhythms of day and night, and filled with a spiritual and cultural richness we can barely imagine. Sleep well, knowing that generations before you found their rest in ways that now seem impossible to us, but that for them were simply life as they knew it.